and learn about every provision of the Constitution by hearing the best arguments on both sides. I'm thrilled that Senator Chris Coons, Democrat of Delaware, and Senator Mike Lee, Republican of Utah, have agreed to be our first senatorial visiting scholars at the National Constitution Center and will join us for bipartisan constitutional debates. And then you can just see from this phenomenal town hall programming the great programs coming up, including a wonderful program on school choice around the country and in Philadelphia, and one on the legacy of Reconstruction, where the finest judges and scholars about Reconstruction will gather, 30 federal judges talking about the meaning of the Civil War amendments to the Constitution, whose 150th anniversary we are commemorating over the next 5 years. All right, ladies and gentlemen, it is now my huge honor and pleasure to ask you to welcome Chief Judge, or rather, he should be Chief Judge. I've just promoted him.
All right.
Your Honor, you just made it, and may it please the court, until you're Chief Judge, you are the Police Commissioner of Philadelphia, Charles Ramsey. Welcome, Judge.
Kind of like the Chief Judge thing a little bit.
You've got it, Your Honor. Here at the Constitution Center, everyone gets a promotion, and I'll try to keep my constitutional arguments short and sweet. So tell us, how did you think to start up this phenomenal program? You visited the Holocaust Museum and you were inspired. What was the idea behind this great policing program?
Well, let me go back to 1998, actually. I was the brand new police chief in Washington, D.C. And whenever you first take over a department, you get a lot of letters and invitations to meet people, to visit various sites. And I got a letter from David Friedman, who is the executive director of the ADL in Washington, and still is, inviting me to visit the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum along with him and a few other people he had invited. And quite frankly, it was just another stop on my schedule. Nothing more, nothing less. Just, full schedule. 12 o'clock, be there, and okay, fine. And so I went. And I met David for the first time, and several other people, and I took a tour of the museum. And I had no idea what to expect. I'm 65 years old. I went through high school in the 1960s. The Holocaust itself was barely touched on back in those days. I mean, if they mentioned it at all, it was in passing, when in history, talking about World War II and so forth, but it was no time spent on it. So my knowledge of it was fairly limited. And so I went through the museum, and there was a survivor by the name of Irene Weiss, who is still alive today. And she accompanied me through the museum, along with several other people. And while, the history is being explained by, the tour guides and so forth, Irene is talking to me about her personal experiences, and which obviously was very, very powerful. And we got to the one part of the museum, and I don't know how many of you have been there, but if you haven't, you need to go, because it's one of the most powerful experiences you'll ever have. There's this boxcar, and you walk through the boxcar, and she's explaining how her family, and they were in a car, standing room only. They had a bucket there for them to, relieve themselves and so forth. It was a horrible trip. And as soon as we walked off, there's this huge photograph as you step off the boxcar. And she pointed and she said, "That's me right there." And it was a photograph that at that point in time, snapped the photograph. And it's a picture of her. And when you look, you can tell it's Irene. And she described what was going on at the time. They had just approached this point where the soldiers were there, and they sent people to the left and to the right, those going, and I forget which side was which, but one side was for work, the other side was straight to the gas chambers. And she was looking for her mother and her younger sister, who were killed that same day. And she was taking one last look, trying to find them somewhere in the crowd. And someone took the picture, and it was Irene. But the bottom line is, it was powerful. It was so powerful, I left there totally confused. And so I came back a couple days later, unannounced, because something was bothering me, and I didn't quite know what it was. And I took my time, and I went through the museum. And it hit me right away. And that was when I started seeing police officers that were part of this whole process of rounding up Jews and even served as death squads and all that sort. Now, I never knew that. Never knew that. It's 1998, so I'm, 58 years old. I never knew that, or 48. Don't make myself older than I really am. And so I started thinking about, how could that be? How could police officers be engaged in this kind of activity? Because prior to Hitler, Germany was a democratic society. The officers took an oath very similar to the one I took and so forth. And how could something like that happen? So you go back in time with some of the issues that we were facing then, which are not nearly as challenging as they are today. But, you had issues around the beginnings of the talk around stop and frisk. You had challenges around, what we now call legitimacy in communities. But at the time, we were just talking about community policing and building relationships and so forth. And we were putting our officers through something called sensitivity training, a term that I absolutely hate. One, it implies everybody is insensitive, and two, it puts people on the defensive just from the very beginning. So, you walk in there and everybody's sitting like this. And so you wind up with black cops on one side, white cops on the other, and nobody's talking, nobody's listening, and it just wasn't getting through. So I said, what if we took, the issue is the role of police in a democratic society and the importance of protecting constitutional rights of people. And so the Holocaust, to me, was a way of getting at this issue, almost a backdoor approach, that would take people in a place totally off guard to be able to have the kinds of discussions they need to have that would bring it back up to current times. And so that's how it started. I sat down with David, and I sat down with people from the Sarah Bloomfield and others from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and designed a curriculum. And my department went through first. We were the only department, and I just saw Marcus Applebaum last week doing another leadership training program. We were in Chicago, and Marcus was there, and Sarah Campbell. 100,000 law enforcement people have gone through that now, federal, state, local, and nobody could have even imagined that. So when I'm here, I'm driving past this wonderful building day after day, and I keep saying, I got to stop in there and take a look, And I never did, and then one day, I'm here, and I see it. And I told, I believe Kevin Long is here now, my lieutenant. I believe I told Kevin, I said, Kevin, give him a call and set up an appointment, because otherwise it just wasn't going to happen. And I came and I met with Carrie and Gina and a few others, and we started talking about designing a curriculum based around the Constitution. Now, I had never been in here, so I really didn't know exactly what was in the building or the kind of exhibits that you had. But it became very clear that the focus is on the evolution of democracy and our Constitution over time, from the Declaration and the actual Constitution to today. And I said, well, we could do the same thing if we took a snapshot of policing during that same period of time and how we've evolved as part of that same democracy. For an example, you wouldn't have had an organized police force in 1776, but if you were in some form of what we would consider policing today, if you were in the South, you might have been catching slaves. That might have been your job. If you were in other places, maybe you were a watchman somewhere, unpaid, just making sure that everything was safe and secure. Fast forward to what is now referred to as Bloody Sunday. Who was it waiting for people to walk across the bridge? It was police enforcing the laws of the time, which were Jim Crow laws and so forth. So the point is this. Our democracy has evolved, but policing has as well, but we've not always stood on the right side of justice as we would define justice today. And I think it's important for us in law enforcement to know that and understand it and know where the baggage is coming from, why some communities there's more tension than in others. Some has to do with past, some has to do with very recent past and current events. And so I think that it's important for us to know where we've been in order for us to really move forward into the future. And what our program here does is it gives people that snapshot in time. I mean, Supreme Court decisions, for an example, many of them came about from police doing something they had no business doing or should not have done. And you wind up with a Supreme Court decision that governs how you are supposed to conduct searches, how you are supposed to do whatever it is you do, reading people Miranda warnings, and all these things happen as a result of some police action. So Terry versus Ohio, stop, question, and frisk. I mean, it goes on and on and on. You need to understand that, and you need to know that, because we focus in training on the technical aspects of policing. If you commit this crime, this is the charge, here's the report you make out, here's how you process evidence, here's how you process personal property, all those things. But what about the... I told you.
Ladies and gentlemen, ma'am, why don't you let the commissioner answer the question? Well, he'll answer it now. If you'll let him answer it, then. Okay.
And I also live in Washington, D.C., where he arrested hundreds of people and detained them without any legitimate reason. Tourists with passports and media with legitimate press passes, and they were held anywhere from 3 to 8 hours without an attorney. I suffered under Chief Ramsey in D.C. I know what I'm talking about.
Okay, thanks. Thank you for that question, Chief.
Well, it's not a question, it's a statement, first of all.
What is your...
Well, there's no question in it. And you know, listen, ma'am, listen, this is...
No, sir.
What, are you talking about Washington?
Yes.
Well...
People who had to sue the city at a time when the city didn't have that kind of money. Stop hijacking the discussion.
Yeah, well...
Hey, shut the hell up.
Ma'am, you asked the question, the chief answered it, and I'd asked you now to let the discussion continue. Thank you all. This was well behaved. We all appreciate the importance of the protest, and we're now going to continue with the conversation. Chief, so this is important, and obviously addressing the kind of tension embodied in the frustration of the Black Lives Matter protest is one of the objects of our program. So how is it going to be effective?
Well, I mean, first thing you have to do is establish dialogue, and I think and an understanding of some of the dynamics that are taking place. But understand that these are some very challenging times right now, and not everything we do are people going to be necessarily pleased with. But the more we do to have an understanding, the more we do to establish dialogue, the more we do to do something other than just, you know, holler, scream, and do whatever, and actually do engage in dialogue, then the more progress we can make on both sides. And we haven't been perfect. We haven't done everything in retrospect the way we wish we had done, perhaps. But at the same time, we have to be able to keep that window open, to keep that door open, to have some positive dialogue.
And tell us This is, ladies and gentlemen, this is important and it's helpful because this is exactly the point of this program. Tell us specifically, how do these programs work? The cops sit down with whom, and what sort of questions do they actually talk about the Constitution?
They don't have the right to peacefully protest here?
You're exercising it and protest away.
Why are they asked to leave?
Because they've made their protest and they're now disrupting our discussion. That's fine. We had their say and we're going to talk about their concerns right now.
So we can listen. You sit down and shut up.
Anyone can understand. We won't listen.
Ladies and gentlemen,
Give somebody else freedom of speech.
we're going to have a conversation about this very topic. No, sir, it's fine. We're going to take questions.
Q&A will come a little later,
We're
sir.
going to take questions later on. There'll be
Q&A
plenty of
will
time
come
for
a little
Q&A,
later.
and following the practice of the National Constitution Center, we will ask you to write your questions down on note cards, which is what we do every single day at this incredible forum for constitutional debate. So please make sure you have questions, write them down, and the chief will take them
This
at
is
the end of the program.
this is an opportunity for the kind of change that's needed to really, I think, not only improve policing, but improve a lot of the conditions in many neighborhoods that right now, our most challenged neighborhoods are the ones that need police the most, and that's where the tension is usually highest with some folks. And we've got to find a way to break through that. And you don't do that if you don't establish dialogue, if you don't establish lines of communication, understanding that you're never going to reach everybody. I mean, because that's just the way it is. And I hate to say that, but there's a criminal element that's actually embedded in many of our communities, and we have to find a way to remove that, but at the same time, not disrupt the larger community. And so I think it's important, and I think that this is a time that we need to take advantage of, because unfortunately, it takes things like this to really make change happen, especially in policing and in society in general. I mean, people don't just do it for no reason. It usually takes something to make people really rethink what they're doing, how they're doing it, and then move forward.
Well, the initial response has been overwhelming. We've had hundreds of policemen. They've come in. They've had responses like, I really appreciated getting to hear both sides, getting to talk to the school kids about how the police affected lives in their communities in precisely the way that protesters were talking about. Give us a specific sense of how it works. You're talking about the history of policing. Is there Q&A, and do you talk about particular constitutional amendments? How does it work?
Well, I mean, certainly there are some amendments that are focused on during the course of this, but I think probably the most interesting part of the entire 4 hours that they spend here is when the students from Constitution High come in. And I know that we're going to get students from other schools as well in the future. But they actually break the recruits into small groups, and they facilitate discussion. You know, how they see police in their neighborhood. And many of these youngsters, I mean, it's very enlightening to have that kind of discussion, that kind of dialogue. And these young people are very sharp. I mean, they don't just sit and listen, you know. I mean, they actually are facilitators. They actually drive the discussion. And it's very enlightening, because I think it's important that we need to know how we're seen by others, how we're viewed by others.
Do you get some of the frustration from the school kids that those protesters just expressed?
I think you get some of that, but it's in a very thoughtful way where there's discussion, there's dialogue, and there's ways in which that gap can be bridged. First of all, you know, this whole issue that we're going through now is nothing new. I mean, I started in law enforcement in late 1968, so I've been around a long time. There were communities, I grew up in Chicago, I started as a Chicago police officer. There were communities that we went into where there was high tension, nobody would talk to you, nobody would provide information. I mean, so this is not new. What's new is social media and a lot of other things now where all these things come out and become, you know, well known. I mean, information travels so fast that it doesn't matter what city you're talking about. Now, if an incident occurs anywhere, we all know about it, and we all feel the effects of whatever it is that took place. So we just in the 40-some-odd years that I've been in policing, we have not fixed the problem. The problem's been around for a long, long time. Now, community policing, I think, went away toward starting to bridge the gap. But then as police, we got so incident-driven and so data-driven and so focused on just lowering crime numbers and so forth that we pulled away from it, and I think that was a huge mistake on our part.
That's a really fascinating observation, that it's social media and videos that have transformed the debate. What does that make you feel about body cams for police?
Oh, I'm a huge proponent of body cameras. I think that it's the direction that we need to go into. Now, technology is the larger issue. When I served as co-chair of the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing, one of the pillars we addressed, Pillar 3, was technology and social media. And some people were disappointed we didn't spend more time talking about body cameras. We did spend time, a little time, talking about it, but the bigger issue to me was technology in general. Technology is advancing faster than policy can keep pace with, and even the law can keep pace with. That's an issue, and we need to sit down and we need to think these things through. And we need people at the table, like the ACLU and others, to talk about these issues and come up with ways in which we can leverage the power of technology and not violate people's constitutional rights. And body cameras is a perfect example. We get a 911 call. We get invited into your home. You know, everything we see is not something you'd want to see on primetime TV. So when is it appropriate for an officer to be filming? When is it appropriate for him not to film? Under what conditions and circumstances? People that want to pass along information to you confidentially certainly do not want to be on camera doing it. What about availability of the video footage to the public at large? I mean, should this be a source of late night entertainment for someone suffering from insomnia that just wants to look at video for the sake of looking at video? I mean, would you want to have your image and your family business out there like that? I'm not saying things are right or wrong. I'm just saying these are issues that need to be discussed, and we need to come to some understanding. We can only do that with the right people in the room having the discussion to develop the kind of policy that needs to be developed, and in some cases even law, that will actually guide us in the future. Use of drones, for an example, facial recognition. Right now, we have technology, for an example, license plate readers. We drive down the street, scan tags, find hot cars, wanted persons, things of that nature. How long do you think it'll be before facial recognition software will be attached to that? And now instead of scanning a license tag, you're scanning the faces of everybody walking down the street. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do it. And we need to have these discussions up front before someone moves forward in a particular area, and then we wind up with some kind of constitutional type issue come up as a result of the technology, which may not have been the intention originally, but it certainly, it can easily be misused or used inappropriately.
So these are the most fascinating and important questions of technology and the Constitution. I'm on a task force of the American Law Institute that's supposed to propose rules for body cameras and drones. So help me out. Should the police be able to take a drone, fly over me, and track me door-to-door, 24/7 in public for a month without individualized suspicion?
Well, but without suspicion, the answer to that, in my opinion, is no. But does that mean that should be banned entirely? Well, you could be somebody who's been making terroristic threats, and we want to know where. I mean, I don't know the answer to those kinds of things, and we need to carefully think it through. And so these are questions that I'm certainly not in a position to answer, nor should I really answer. I can provide some thought and input, perhaps. But I think there are legal scholars that really need to sit down and debate this. What are the limits of our authority as police, so that we don't change things to a point where, 25, 50 years from now, people don't recognize America because it's been fundamentally changed. And I think that this is a dangerous time, and I'll use terrorism as an example. And I'll even go back to what I talked about earlier with the Holocaust and the protection of people's constitutional rights. It's easy to have an event take place. And in our country, 9/11 is something that we'll always remember, just like a generation before us remember Pearl Harbor, and we'll never forget Pearl Harbor. This is our version of Pearl Harbor, 9/11. But does that make all Muslims bad, all Muslims terrorists? No. And it's easy, though, to single that group of people out and somehow want to treat them differently than someone else because of what happened. We got to be careful about that kind of stuff. The time we need our Constitution is in times of crisis and turmoil, not when everything is going well and everything's going right. I mean, you need it at a time when these kinds of challenges are present. And I think that's an important thing to remember and not allow ourselves to go down a path that is a very, very dangerous one if we allow that sort of thing to happen.
And then after legal scholars and others propose rules, do legislatures need to adopt them? Illinois just adopted some pretty good rules, but is that what has to happen?
In some cases, but again, that's got to be part of the discussions. Yeah, and I would think that some of it is going to require that. You know, and it's not just police. I mean, yeah, we have to be real about the society we live in now. You can't go anywhere without being on camera. I mean, you are on camera at times you don't even know you're on camera. It's just a fact of life. How many times do you find out now that, you know, there's been some breach in some major corporation's database and your information could be floating around out there, and guess what? It happened 2 years ago or 8 months ago, and you just finding out about it. I mean, so it's got to go beyond just police. We got to deal with this whole issue of cyber crime, and we need to really sit down, because it's not going to get better, it's going to get worse. And we need to really deal with it, not just from the perspective of just how it impacts law enforcement and policing, but just society in general.
Back to legitimacy, Black Lives Matter. You just served on the President's Commission. The President Obama gave you something like 100 days or some crazy deadline to come up with.
It was more like 70.
70 days, right, to come up with solutions post-Ferguson. What were some of the leading solutions you came up with, and what did you learn from the experience?
Well, I mean, it was a tremendous experience. We had a very diverse group on the task force, civil rights activists, a couple young people that, one, Brittany Packnett, who is fresh off the protest lines in St. Louis, Jose Lopez in New York. There were academics that were a part of that group, lawyers. I mean, it was a representative from a union, police union, that was part of the group, 3 police chiefs. So it was very diverse, but we were able to reach consensus on every issue that we tackled, and we decided to create 6 pillars that we would focus on. We didn't have much time, so obviously we couldn't tackle everything. The very first recommendation was that the President create a task force or commission to look at the entire criminal justice system. The last time that was done was 1965. Lyndon Baines Johnson was President of the United States. It's time to look at the entire system, not just policing. You got to look at prosecution, you got to look at the courts, you got to look at corrections, you got to look at reentry. You have to look at the drivers of crime, poverty, education, things of that nature. You really do need to have a comprehensive look at the entire picture. That has yet to be done, by the way. And then we took a look at these 6 key areas that we thought were important. Certainly building trust and legitimacy, policy and oversight, technology and social media, training and education, community policing and crime reduction, officer safety and wellness. Those were the 6 areas that we looked at. And for that shorter period of time, I think we did a pretty good job of putting together concrete recommendations. Now we're in the process of going around the country trying to get departments to implement these recommendations.
And you think they're going to implement them?
I think most are. I think that many are. I think that police agencies are more progressive than we're often given credit for. But there are some that just, I mean, change is just not easy. And whereas there's a lot of focus on police and misconduct, and we can't investigate ourselves, and we don't, this so-called blue wall of silence and so forth. And I'm not saying that there's none of that goes on, but name a profession where it doesn't. I mean, how many lawyers turn in other lawyers for not properly representing their clients, or doctors turning in doctors for malpractice, or even members of the media who may turn in a reporter for not properly checking their sources and so forth. I mean, come on. I mean, that's a problem beyond just policing. Doesn't make it right, but let's not just pile on here. We've got issues that need to be fixed, but thoughtful discussion is how we're going to get them resolved.
Well, that is what we're all about here, and we have a huge number of thoughtful questions suggesting the intensity of interest in this. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for writing them. Let's see how many of these good questions we can get through. In your TED Talk at Temple a few months ago, you talked about officers' mindset and the impact it has on their effectiveness in the community. What are some things you can do to try to adjust your officers' mindset in such a polarized environment?
Well, I don't know if it's so much adjusting mindset as it is really constantly reinforcing the need for officers. First, let me back up a little bit. Everyone in this room has a bias of some kind. I mean, it's just human nature. And one step in our training, which is becoming a part of training curriculum in academies around the country, is fair and impartial policing. How do you deal with implicit bias? How do you deal with those kinds of issues to understand yourself and not let it interfere with your job as a police officer, your duties as a police officer? And that's a struggle. It is a struggle because what police officers witness and what they see every single day is not the most positive things going on in communities. We talk about, and I'll just get right at it, this current movement of Black Lives Matter. I could not agree more that Black lives matter. I mean, I'm a 65-year-old African-American male, grew up in a challenged community, I mean, granted, I may not be totally in line with some of the thinking and so forth, but the basic concept I agree with. But I think that the focus is so narrow on just police that we're missing an opportunity here for a much broader discussion that could really lead to substantive change. I would also argue that the focus merely on the dead is not where it needs to be, because the lives of the people who are living in poverty, who they're forced to send their kids to inferior schools, knowing that they're sending their kids to inferior schools, those lives matter too. And so we've got to think about this in much broader terms and take advantage of what's going on now, because you got everybody's attention. Everybody's attention. And we can do one of two things. We can either take advantage of it and actually have the kind of dialogue that's going to lead to real change, or we'll squander it with just, disrupting things, this, that, and the other, but not sitting down engaging in the kind of dialogue that really leads to real change. And so I think it goes beyond just, where we are right now. And if we're going to talk about, let's just go back to homicide, go back to people that have been killed. How important is it that we focus on how the life is lost or who took the life, when if lives matter, then it doesn't matter who took the life. And we got to deal with the reality of black-on-black crime, the challenges in many of our communities. I mean, I had someone ask me the other day, and we were talking about how scared they were of police, and I said, well, okay, fine. But when you buy that deadbolt lock for your door, are you doing it to keep the police out, or are you doing it to keep the thug around the corner out? Who are you buying the lock for? Why you put the alarm on your car when you walk away from your car? When you get a permit to carry a gun, are you doing it so you can protect yourself against a rogue cop, or are you doing it to protect yourself against somebody who's about to stick you up? I mean, we got to really have honest discussion, and it requires a hard look at ourselves and come up with some hard, and here's some very hard truths. And I don't see that happening the way it ought to happen.
Well, that's what we're going to do here with your program at the Constitution Center. The next question is, how successful has Philadelphia been in countering the don't snitch attitude? What are the newest elements in community relations?
Like everybody else, we got our successes and our failures. Listen, I'm not going to sit here and act as if we've got some magical thing going on in Philadelphia. We suffer from the same issues that everyone else is right now. We have some areas where we've got great relationships. We've got others where we struggle. And we're trying to figure out a way in which we can have greater reach and greater impact. I think we're doing better than some, but not as good as others, perhaps. This is a work in progress. And I think the other thing that we've learned when we pulled away from community policing is just how fragile relationships are. You don't just do it for a while and then say, okay, we got this, now let's move on to something else. They're very fragile, and they'll always be fragile. And so we have to constantly work at maintaining relationships. No one case should shatter that relationship. Even if it's something that's totally inappropriate, people should still have the faith that it'll be dealt with in a fair and impartial way, and that you know, the outcome will be one that's based on a review that has been totally objective and impartial. I stayed away from justice being done because we live in a world now where justice is defined based on what you personally think ought to happen as opposed to anything else, and that's not justice, in my opinion.
Two related questions. The U.S. Justice Department made many suggestions for the department. Have you been able to implement any of them? And would you support a law that put investigation of alleged police brutality in a state agency and prosecutions handled by the DOJ?
Well, there were 97 recommendations from collaborative reform. I asked for them to come in back in March of 2013, May of 2013. They gave their report in March of this year. 97 recommendations. We're in the process of implementing those. We're in the process of implementing recommendations from the President's task force. 37 of those recommendations of the 64 actually apply to local, state and local departments. I've already been in conversation with our state police about the possibility of them being the lead in investigations involving officer-involved shootings, involving people from my agency. One of the recommendations in the President's task force report, which was a bit on the controversial side in the minds of some, was that the prosecutorial review ought to be made by someone outside of that particular jurisdiction. You get a lot of pushback from district attorneys. And again, it's not to say that we can't conduct our own investigations, nor is it to say that the prosecutors are incapable of reviewing these cases objectively. But what's the perception? And I think that if we're all honest here, we can all point to cases that really the outcome really was not what I would think it ought to be. And I think that it's not as objective as it should be in some cases. So I think that, I personally, that's the direction in which we ought to go.
Do you have the power to implement that in Philly, or does that take a federal change?
Well, it doesn't take a federal change, but it's being challenged right now by our union as an unfair labor practice. But that's something I'll have to deal with in Harrisburg. And there is an effort also. There is a member of the state House that introduced a law that would actually prohibit me from divulging the name of officers that are involved in shootings under any circumstances. And I'm sure there's more to that statute, the proposed statute as well. So we get a little pushback, but I think you got to still move forward.
A related question from our great audience, which is doing my interviewing work for me. In your long career as a member of law enforcement, how has the role of police unions changed or not changed in opposing or supporting police reform? Well,
listen, I came on prior to unions. When I started my career, organizations were more just, well, fraternal organizations. They weren't really unions. That came about in the mid-'70s in many cities, late '70s. I don't know about Philly, but Chicago, I think, was '78, somewhere around there. I think they get increasingly powerful, and I think in some cases too powerful. I think that certainly when it comes to salary and benefits, I'm not anti. I believe that that's good. I think that people are entitled to police officers due process, and there ought to be a union to make sure that that happens. But I do think that when they get into operational areas and setting a policy, I think that's too far a reach. So I think that there needs to be more collaboration and more dialogue, and not an us against them type of situation. But let me say that the relationship I have here is one where we agree to disagree. And so, and I am not anti-union, because I also know what it was like prior to unions when management did screw over the rank and file. So I've seen both sides of it.
Question on lots of people's minds: how can you keep legitimate stop and frisk from becoming nothing more than racial profiling?
Well, it's Terry stops. I mean, you have to do it within the constitutional guidelines with reasonable suspicion. But I also think that we can't ignore the disproportionate amount of crime that occurs in some communities, particularly gun violence and things of that nature. And I think you have to look at each stop individually. Racial profiling is wrong. People should not engage in that at all. But they need to be able to articulate reasonable suspicion for the stop. And that's where our training focuses.
How do you train the recruits about Terry stops?
Well, I mean, we go right into the law, and we go right into scenarios as to when it's appropriate, under what circumstances can you make a stop versus, and just because you stop an individual, you don't automatically have to search them. Depends on the stop. It depends on whether or not you think that person is in possession of a weapon. So under what circumstances is it appropriate not just to stop an individual, but then to pat them down for weapons. And so we develop scenarios. We're getting more and more into reality-based training where we put officers into situations, they exercise judgment, then you challenge them on that. Why did you stop this? And what do, write the, we call it a 48A, which is a report that you have to write because you need to be able to articulate the reasons why you stopped an individual. And so those are the kinds of exercises that we go through so that people clearly understand their limitations.
This is great. I teach these cases to law students, but it's very abstract, and I ask one of them to come up and the others sort of pat them down and figure out whether they can have articulable suspicion of danger to the officer. But you're saying that specific scenarios where you test the officer's intuitions and then figure out whether they did right.
Well, you design scenarios, and so reality-based training was one of the recommendations in collaborative reform, and one of the conversations I had with the deputy that oversees training is that even when we go through scenarios, for an example, with traffic stops. Now, traditionally what we do is our instructors will focus on the tactics that the officer's using. Did you park your car at a certain angle? How did you approach if it's a felony car stop? How did you do this, that, and the other? Which is good, and we're going to continue to do that because that keeps officers safe. But I also want them to judge based on the conversation that takes place between the driver and the officer, or the pedestrian and the officer, because that's equally important. It's not just about the stop and the reasonable suspicion, it's also how you treat the person during that encounter. And so we need to judge people, our officers rather, on that interaction just as critically as we do the stop itself. Because the average, most of the beefs, and we got chiefs from other jurisdictions here as well, most of the complaints I get as it relates to street stops is not about the stop, it's about the way the person was treated during the stop. That interaction, that, once you know you no longer have that armed robber or that felon or whatever, I mean, at some point in time, the situation has to de-escalate. So how do you de-escalate the situation? Where you have a person that's not real happy because they got stopped. And maybe verbally they're coming at you a little aggressively. How do you de-escalate that? So that's a scenario that you need to work people through as well, because we have to teach people how to do that. And I think that as a society, we're kind of losing a lot of our, socialization skills, our ability to be able to communicate. We text all the time. I mean, we don't talk to people like we, need to talk to them, where you can look them in the eye, you hear the inflection of the voice. There's ways in which you can bring things down. I mean, if I text a sentence to you, you might be very offended by it, but if I said it to you while we're in this conversation, it would be a totally different reaction that you would have because of all the different dynamics that go on, body language, tone, everything. So we need to really not take that for granted, because we're pulling a whole generation of people who grew up texting, who were growing up, and it's getting more and more a part of it. So we have to teach basic skills, again, on how to interact, how you de-escalate situations, body language, all these kinds of things.
This is so important. It relates to this next question. What kinds of sensitivity training do beat cops get? And I'll just say, what kind of sensitivity training are they going to get here at the Constitution Center about how to treat people with respect?
Well, it is all about respect. And so, again, even though that term sensitivity training was used, and I'll forgive whoever wrote it, because that's, but
that's very sensitive.
It is about respect, and it's about respect in here. And I don't know if I'm putting this in a way that makes any sense. Depending on who you're talking to and the challenges that they have in life, that takes on a whole different meaning. And my staff has heard this story, and I'm going to bore them with it, because it's one way that I've always kept in mind the need to respect the people that I encounter. When I was a young sergeant in narcotics in Chicago. We would go on some raids, and some of them were pretty risky. I mean, you had people in there that, you know, armed and, you know, drug dealing and all that sort of thing. And so you go in pretty hard, and you know, you're knocking doors down and all that sort of thing. And there's an awful lot of chaos. But after a while, things settle down, and now you got to start de-escalating things as you're starting to search and all that sort of thing. I had one guy that worked for me, a detective by the name of Paris Patton, who's since passed away, God rest his soul. But he had a knack that you don't see in many people, irrespective of age, and that is the ability to take the most volatile situation and get it de-escalated. I mean, we were locking up for serious drug offenses, and he would be, I mean, by the time we were walking out of there, they're you know, in a pleasant conversation, polite conversation, or you give them a cigarette, or, well, I mean, it was just a total change from what happened when we first entered the place. And I remember we were coming back from a particularly bad raid where a lot of weapons, a lot of chaos, a lot of everything, and he pulled his magic. And I asked him, I said, man, how the heck do you do it? I mean, what is it? And he told me something that I've never, ever forgotten, and I apologize for those that may have heard it before, but it's an easy way of remembering the importance of respect. He said, at the moment of birth, everyone is a perfect 10, but immediately deduct 3, because no one lives forever. Life is just temporary. He said, if you're born into a dysfunctional family, deduct another 3, because you have no role models. I mean, you've got substance abuse, domestic violence, and all these kinds of things going on, so you're going to be at a disadvantage. He said, if you're a minority, take away another 3, because there may be some doors that aren't open to you, and you're poor and a minority, that may be open to others. He said, that leaves 1. That 1 is a person's dignity and self-respect. He said, do what you have to do as a police officer, but never, ever do anything to take that person's dignity or self-respect away from them, because that's all they got left, and they will fight you to hold on to it. I mean, I never forgot that. I never forgot that. Now, some people have a, you know, kind of a warped sense of what respect is. I carry a gun to get respect, this, that, and the other, but it gets back to the same thing. There are some people that just don't have a whole lot left. And then here we come with more drama. I mean, so be respectful toward people. And if you're respectful, they'll be respectful in return. Will there be some that fall out of that? Absolutely. But the majority, no. Majority of people will give you respect back. And you can arrest a person. There's no need to disrespect them in the process. And if you can remember that, and I tell that story to recruits, and I've said it quite often, but I think it's a good way to remember, because 30 years later, I still remember what he said to me, because it was a different way of looking at it and understand, not just looking at it, but understanding from the perspective of somebody else what it's like and how much something like respect means. I can't tell you how many homicides we deal with, and by the time we try to find a motive, what happened? Well, he disrespected me. Sometimes it's a glance, it's a look, step on the foot, looked at his girlfriend or whatever, but they felt disrespected. And it leads to a homicide, leads to shooting. And why is it that you shake your head and you say, over that? Yeah, but to that person, that means something, because that's all they got. They got nothing else to hold on to. So respect takes on a whole different meaning to some folks. And you need to understand that, because we deal with all kinds of people. And quite frankly, fate and circumstance is the only thing that separates us in life. I mean, I'm a paycheck away from being in a similar situation, perhaps. So, I mean, you know, with a few breaks here and there, or the lack of a few breaks here and there, you may be on the other side of this thing. So you can never afford to judge, but always respect, no matter what. What does it cost you? Nothing. Nothing.
Well, that's what those protesters are saying. They're saying that every life deserves respect.
It does.
What are you going to say to the protesters to make them feel like every life
I
is being
agree
respected?
that it does. I mean, there's no disagreement. We're not really out of line on a lot of this. But at some point in time, you got to sit down and have some dialogue and really talk. You also have to realize that everyone shot by a police officer is not someone who was unarmed and innocent and whatever. Sometimes listen, I've been here 7.5 years, a little more than that. I've had 8 police officers killed in the line of duty. 5 of them shot to death. I had 5 in a 9-month span. That's real. That's reality. That's the stuff that we do have to deal with. But does that mean then that you have to go into every neighborhood thinking everybody's out to shoot you or kill you? No. Now, and the reason why we added the sixth pillar in the President's Task Force, Officer Safety and Wellness, because that's an issue that we've got to come to grips with, and I think it really drives behavior and some of the other problems we've got. You know, post-traumatic stress disorder is not something that's just that just affects soldiers coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan. You do this job for 20, 30 years, believe me, it has an impact. Homicides. My wife, we were watching something the other day, and there was a scene with a lot of shootings and stuff, and she's sitting there cringing and turning her head and stuff, and I'm sitting there looking at it and got another hand of popcorn and kept on going. And, well, well, I've seen that 40-some-odd years. I'm not saying it's right or whatever, but do you get a little desensitized to it? Yeah, you do. Because if you don't, you go crazy. I worked in homicide. I mean, I've gone to more crime scenes than you can possibly imagine. You have to build up mechanisms in order to be able to survive and to be able to do it. And so you have to be resilient, but we all have various levels of resiliency. And so, whereas if a police officer gets shot or stabbed, we're very good at it. We will take care of them. We will get them back on their feet. They'll get the best medical care and all that. But what about the psychological impact, the psychological trauma that is sometimes? And it has to be something incredibly unusual for us to even think in those terms. I had a young cop when I was police chief in D.C. They go on a call of a disturbance, and they get there, and a woman opens the screen door and hands the officer a baby, about a 2-year-old baby that had been decapitated. That officer had a 2-year-old at home. Wound up, that would freak anybody out. But I mean, we don't talk, the invisible wounds, we don't talk about that stuff. That's not normal even for us. It's not normal. And so we expect, and part of the culture of policing, which is unfortunate, but it's all, suck it up and keep moving, suck it up and keep moving. But you can only do that so long. And when you look at policing and you look at at substance abuse, alcoholism, substance abuse, all these kinds of issues, domestic violence in policing, where do you think that comes from? Some of it comes from the exposure that people have that goes untreated, where people lose their balance. And I would argue that that's part of the problem. And the other part is the way in which we treat our own employees. We have a big thing in there, procedural justice, and we need to treat people this, that, and the other. And yet as organizations, now there are folks that were even here today, oh, you guys are just letting cops do X, Y, Z. As the cops, they think we're so punishment driven, we're too hard on them. What about internal procedural justice? What about dealing with behavior? I'm not talking about criminal misconduct, I'm not talking about the real serious stuff, but dealing with it in a different way, other than just you suspend it for a day, you suspend it for 2 days, you suspend it for 5 days. What about internal procedural justice? If we don't treat our own employees in a fair and impartial way, then how do we expect them to leave roll call and go out and treat the public differently? And so it's complex, but it's all fixable stuff. But we got to look at it beyond just how we interact and how we treat community. We have to look at it also in another way if we really want to have an outcome that's going to really lead to real fundamental change.
Well, this is riveting, and I know that all of us could go on for a lot longer. We have this next phenomenal panel with the top scholars of policing in America that I want you to stay for and hear. But I want to ask as a last question. So we've had hundreds of recruits here already talking to school kids about the Constitution. The Holocaust Museum has 100,000, and I know we want to get in that many. What is your hope that this program here at the National Constitution Center will accomplish in teaching police about the Constitution?
The police understand their role in society, which is a unique role. It's a complicated role, but it's one that they have to understand. It's not about, one of the biggest mistakes we made years ago was starting to refer to ourselves as law enforcement as opposed to just police. and dealing with the profession of policing as opposed to law enforcement. Because what we've done to ourselves is narrowly define our role into just enforcing laws. The reality is we do far more than just enforce laws. We have cops that bristle at the thought of, you know, oh, I'm not a social worker. Yes, you are. You may not have a license, but you do it every single day. And there's nothing wrong with it, by the way. This job is about serving. It's about helping. It's about making a difference in the lives of others. And however way you do that is how you do it. So we wear a lot of hats. And law enforcement is only one of many, many, many. And so if we can get officers to have a broader view, a broader perspective and understanding of their role in society, understanding the words when they take that oath and they swear to uphold the law, but also uphold the Constitution of the United States and of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, understand what that really means. The Constitution is there for a reason. And you mentioned, you know, D.C. I'm far from perfect, believe me. And I've made more than my share of mistakes. I try not to make the same one more than once if I can avoid it. But I've made my share of mistakes. But I've grown and I've evolved over time because I didn't think this way 30 years ago, 20, I didn't think this way at all. You know, it was a time in my life I thought we could lock our way out of everything, lock up everybody and so forth, chase the bad guys and all that. And that's always going to be a part of what we do, but we have a much broader responsibility and mission in life, and that is just protecting others, creating safe and healthy neighborhoods, doing what we can to make a difference in the lives of others. And if they come out of here with a broader understanding of their role and their responsibilities, then I think we'll be successful.
Ladies and gentlemen, for what he is doing to teach the police about the Constitution, please join me in thanking Chief Charles Ramsey.
Thank you. Okay. Exit stage left.